I want to talk about my life with model airplanes, not my whole life, mind you, but my story of model airplanes and big airplanes. And I was really fortunate to get to grow up in this family, which was a flying family. Both mom and dad were pilots. And in this cool picture, this is not dad's airplane. This is mom's airplane. She and two of her girlfriends from college decided they were going to learn how to fly. So the three of these women bought a J2 Taylor Cub and were learning how to fly in it, and that's how she met my dad. Dad had been a pilot in the Army Air Corps in the 1930s when the Army Air Corps flew the airmail. And this cool picture shows my dad making it through with the first airmail to come from the West Coast into Newark. And why in the world were they the first ones to make it through? Here's this article mentions his big bomber. Well, here's a picture of his big bomber. This was the front-line bomber in 1934, the Keystone B7 Bomber. And you notice in this picture, it wasn't a very pretty day when they made it through. What happened was there had been a weather recall. They had a broken radio, so they didn't get the weather recall. So they pressed on through and made it with the first Western airmail. So naturally, I've got lots of pictures like this. My older brother and I sitting on a little toy out at the airport that used to exist in Cooperstown, New York, which is where I happened to be living when I was born. That's where I was born, was in Cooperstown, New York. Dad, when I was 10 years old, went to work for the FAA as a test pilot. He had just received his aeronautical engineering degree. So from the time I was 10 years old, I knew that I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and I wanted to be a test pilot like my dad. And this was my dad's FAA test pilot school class. My dad is the second one from the left, Paul Gibson. And over the years, Dad got to fly a whole bunch of neat airplanes. This, I think, is a PL-4 that he was going out to fly some kind of a flight test in. I honestly don't know what he was doing with it, but he's wearing a parachute, so I'm guessing it was some kind of a risky flight, a structural test or something like that. Dad was my instructor. He had an instructor's rating, and so he was teaching me how to fly. And most of my flight time up to my private license, which I got when I was 17 years old, was in this airplane, which was a Luscombe 8A. And of course, I was involved with model airplanes. This was my control line Nobler that I had, and I couldn't afford RC at that time, so it was mostly all control line. This was my Vico Thunderbird that's almost finished. The canopy's not on it yet in this picture. And I got into a little bit of free flight as well. These pictures were all from when I was about 15 and 16 years old. So been involved in model aviation and the Academy of Model Aeronautics, AMA, ever since I was 15 years old. So it's just been a wonderful thing, and it taught me a lot. It teaches you a lot, as all of us know, about aerodynamics, about stability and control, and about all these things that are going to be real important to you if you find your way into flight training. And this was a picture from, God, I hate to admit how many years ago it was. So when I was first commissioned, this was my commissioning day as an ensign in the Navy, October the 17th of 1969. And I went on into flight training from there, of course. Okay, it was 1969. I'm really old. Went into flight training, and of course, Dad had been my instructor pilot, and Dad was there for my commissioning as well as when I received my wings. And I got to fly some neat things in the Navy. Got to fly the F-4 Phantom as my first assignment out of pilot training. Flew it in Southeast Asia in 1972 and then again in 1973. And also got to be in the very first operational F-14 squadron starting in late 1973 and made the first cruise with the F-14. Now most people don't realize it. We had one day of combat in Vietnam with the F-14s. We flew, and I say combat, it was quote combat. We flew air cover for the evacuation of Saigon, which was April the 30th of 1975. So the day that the Helicopters were landing on the embassy grounds and on rooftops all over Saigon. I was overhead in an F-14, loaded up with missiles and weapons just in case we needed to do something. In fact, we didn't need to do anything. They just wanted to let us go ahead and get our people and leave. So, had a pretty neat career in the Navy. My dad taught me how to fly airplanes. I taught my dad how to fly radio control. And this is a picture of us starting my craft, Quick Fly, I guess is what it was. Had that airplane for years and years and years. It was old, reliable. I mean, just flew time after time. And as I mentioned, I taught Dad how to fly RC. So Dad got into it. He got his own airplanes. He had a Senior Falcon, a Goldberg Senior Falcon that he flew a lot. Also had a, let's see, a Windward glider from Mark's Models, and got a lot of flight time in on that. And I got to spend a lot of really quality time with my dad, both in airplanes and also in RC flying. This was my F-16. I built a scratch-built model of the F-16, and my first one flew in 1975. I made my own mold and made a fiberglass fuselage for it. 75 was the same year that Bob Violet flew his first A4 Skyhawk ducted fan model. And then test pilot school got in my way, ruined my whole life, and it took me several years before I finished developing this one, which was my second version of the F-16. And I took this to the Nationals in 1981 and got third place in sport scale with it. I never did have Dad fly it because it was a little bit of a handful, and I crashed it a couple times, but I've still got it. To this day, I still have that model, and I want to convert it over to electric. And what a wonderful innovation electric ducted fans have been compared to the gas-powered fans where, man, you were working that needle valve trying to tweak it and get 21,500 RPM if you could, and then you'd get it up in the air and it would lean out in the air and you'd burn the glow plug and get to do a no-power landing. I did a whole bunch of those. And now electric, if you don't want to go that fast, just pull the power back a little bit. It is so slick doing the electric ducted fans now. And I built this model, and I'm going to show another picture of it later on. This was sort of an ambitious model. I think it's probably one of the most ambitious models I've ever attempted. Maybe that's why it still hasn't flown yet. But it's the Convair Pogo, and the first thing I did was I built the propeller mechanism for it, a contra-rotating propeller, and I took a bunch of helicopter gears and drive shafts and stuff like that, and a gentleman named Rube Goldberg helped me design the arrangement. And I've got an OS Max 61, I guess, going through a clutch and turning all of these gears and stuff, and it actually works. I made the prop, the contra-rotating propeller and the engine mechanism first because there was no sense in building the model unless I had a contra-rotating prop that I could fly it with. So I got all that to work, and I haven't made a whole lot of progress in it, and I'm thinking this is a good candidate to switch over to electric. What about the big model airplane? Well, gee, you know, all of the things that we do when we build model airplanes, working with wood, working with some welding, composites, fabric, all of those things are the sorts of things that we do in full-size airplanes. So I bought this airplane in 1983, which was a Formula One racer, a cassette. And just to put this picture in perspective, the little baby playing in the airplane is now 27 years old. That's my son, Paul. And of course, my wife, Ray, who was also an astronaut, standing next to the airplane. I bought this cassette that needed to be rebuilt. I spent about a year rebuilding it. That's the fuselage, obviously. There's what the wing looked like when I got it. And of course, you know how we get our models partway along and then you piece them together and take pictures of it to see what it looks like. Of course, I did that with the cassette. Notice I've got an aluminum bar holding up the cowling under it so it would look good for a photo. I've got a screwdriver stuck in one of the wheel pants to hold the wheel pant on for the picture. And of course, you do this every so often just to re-motivate yourself so that you'll get back to work on it and finish it. Took me about a year to rebuild it, and that's what it looked like when I finished rebuilding it. And right before my first shuttle flight, which was in 1984, I had the airplane all finished, and I was ready to test fly it. And my boss, the director of flight operations at NASA, found out that I had this airplane all built, and I was contemplating the idea of going on a test flight in about January of '84. Well, I was due to launch February the 3rd of '84. And my boss said, well, Mr. Gibson, what was it you were planning on doing with this airplane? And I said, well, sir, of course, I'm going to fly it. And he said, just when did you think you were going to go fly this airplane? And I said, and I might be not smarter than a fifth grader, but I can sure read between the lines. And I said, well, you know, I was thinking I probably wouldn't go test fly it until after my mission. And he said, I think that's a real good idea. Now, notice he didn't tell me not to do it. But in fact, back then I used to obey all the rules. And so I didn't do it. I waited until after I got back from my mission and then started flying this airplane again, early 1984. Well, I never really did like this wing that's on it. I'm an aeronautical engineer. Oh, wait, I didn't say that right. I are an aeronautical engineer is how you're supposed to say it. I'm an aeronautical engineer. This is a constant chord, low aspect ratio wing. And also I had cheated. I had watched John Sharp race at Reno, and I knew that a tapered high aspect ratio wing would make the airplane go faster, so I made one. And how are we going to make a wing? Well, gee whiz, the way we modelers make wings. We're going to get a foam core, and we're going to fiberglass and graphite it. The graphite in this picture is on the wing spar caps. It's a very thin wing. It's a 6% airfoil, which is 6% thick, which is kind of an interesting number. The X-1, when Chuck Yeager went supersonic, was flying with a 10% thick airfoil. So I have a thinner wing than the X-1 had when it went supersonic the very first time. Since it's so thin, the spar obviously is not going to be very high. And as we all know, the moment of inertia of a spar is BH cubed over 12. So H cubed, when it's real small, means it's not going to be very effective for you. So I had to make the spar caps out of carbon fiber. It was 0.13 inches of carbon fiber or 0.4 of an inch of fiberglass if I wanted to make them out of fiberglass. So of course, carbon fiber won. And it really changed the looks of the airplane. You can see it's a very thin airfoil, tapered wing, 2-to-1 taper ratio. I did a structural test on it on the ground with cement bags, and then I took it up to 11,500 feet with a parachute on and put 6.8 Gs on it, and it didn't even break in half. So I guess I really are an engineer capable of designing and building my own airfoil. Well, over the years, the airplane has evolved. The prior picture is what it looked like when I've set an altitude record with it in 1991. Well, gee, we don't think of Formula One racers as altitude machines, but it was a very efficient wing. And I was able to take it up on January the 31st of 1991 to 27,000 feet and broke the world altitude record for airplanes that weigh less than 500 kilograms. And that record stood for about 2 years, and then somebody broke it. Well, this is what the airplane looks like today. I've got a new canopy on it, a different cowling, different wheel pants, and so it has evolved quite a bit, and it's picked up more speed. In April of '04, I took it out and broke the world's 100-kilometer closed course speed record with it. This has a 100 horsepower engine, and my average speed over the 100-kilometer closed course was 237.9 miles an hour on a 100 horsepower engine. And I didn't have favorable winds that day. I was hoping for something over 240. But I broke a world record that had stood for almost 20 years. It was established in July of 1984 by Jim Miller, and I broke it in 2004. So it stood for almost 20 years when I broke it, so maybe I'll get to keep it for another 20 years. So anyway, this airplane has been a lot of fun, and it's a little bit of a fallout from model airplanes, because you build it just like model airplanes, You do all the same things that we do with model airplanes. Oh yeah, and along the way, I got to fly this other pretty cool machine. You know, I have to confess I had not been interested in being an astronaut until we started developing space shuttles, because I was an airplane person. I wanted things with wings on them. Wasn't interested in flying an Apollo capsule or any of those things. When they came out with shuttle, I said, oh man, that's for me. I've got to have one of those, and set my sights on doing that. In the meantime, I had already been through test pilot school, because again, I knew I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like Dad, and got selected in the very first space shuttle class. And this was my first ride. I flew Challenger in, we already talked about, February the 3rd of 1984, and got to go to space, and I'll tell you what a thrill that is. This is our liftoff, and we go from this position, sitting on the launch pad, to orbit in 8.5 minutes. You can't get to your car in 8.5 minutes from right here, but in 8.5 minutes, you go from sitting still to 17,500 miles an hour. So what a ride that is. Better than any Porsche I've ever been in. And it is a thrill. This is where you are at the end of 2 minutes. And the smoke trail is dissipating, which means we have burned out the 2 booster rockets, the 2 big white booster rockets on the side. Those are out of fuel at the end of 2 minutes. We drop those into the ocean. We have 2 ships that retrieve them and tow them back into port. But at this point, you are 30 miles up at the end of 2 minutes. You're 30 miles up, 30 miles out over the Atlantic, going 4,000 miles an hour. Now, I had not been 4,000 miles an hour before, and that's a thrill. That's a real thrill, going that fast. And on that first mission that I was on, we sent 2 of our guys outside to do the world's first untethered spacewalk. Every time we've ever had astronauts or cosmonauts outside their spacecraft, they've been fastened to it with tethers. We are obviously flying a rocket pack in this case. You can see he's got 1 control stick in each hand. And they use this rocket pack to fly kind of far away. And equally as important to them, back to the shuttle when they were done. Now, we could go pick them up. If they had a problem with their rocket pack and the thing failed or they ran out of fuel, we could fly Challenger over to them, because we have 44 of the large thrusters pointing in all different directions, and we can maneuver the thing in orbit to go pick them up. But it was going to cost a lot of money for us to go get them, and I was going to negotiate a price ahead of time. And the other interesting thing about spacewalks, I was a pilot astronaut, and we never get to go outside and do spacewalks, and the reason for that is we are much too valuable to risk us outside. So the mission specialists, we got lots of those. We let them do all the space. You know, in actuality, it is to even out the amount of training time. The pilots spend so much time training on the vehicle systems, the launches, the aborts, the landing, rendezvous, docking, and all that stuff. Let's see, did I leave anything out? Anyway, that's some of the stuff that the pilots train on. To even out the training, the mission specialists get to do all the spacewalks. I was so jealous when I looked outside. Just picture what he is looking at under his boots. He's looking at the Earth 185 miles below his feet. I was so jealous that I didn't get to go do that. Well, my final mission was the first docking that a space shuttle ever did. I commanded the Space Shuttle Atlantis in 1995, and we went to this space station, which is the Russian space station Mir. Now, it's interesting, people also ask me, well, did the Russians speak English so that you could talk to them? The answer is niet. They did not speak much of any English, and with their financial state that they were in back then, they couldn't afford to hire English teachers or buy English textbooks for their cosmonauts, so we had to make the effort to learn to speak Russian. And I say make the effort because, again, I are an engineer, and engineers are pretty good at math, although if you watched me on Fifth Grader, you wouldn't think so. But engineers are pretty good at math and physics and stuff like that, not languages. So here's what I know best in Russian, and it's clean. Я говорю по-русски очень плохо и понимаю ничего. Does anyone speak Russian here? Oh, all right, good, I get away with it. No, what I actually said was, I speak Russian very badly and understand nothing. But what happens if you get up there in orbit or you're on your way up to space and you needed to turn to the cosmonauts and say, Извините, пожалуйста, у нас есть маленький пожар на борту прямо сейчас. You'd be in trouble if you didn't know Russian. And what I just said was, excuse me, please, we have a small fire on board right now. So we had to get to where we were conversant in Russian. Now, I am not fluent by any stretch of the imagination in Russian, but as you've just heard, I can carry on a very poor conversation in Russian to this day. So the good news was, once I pounded what little Russian into my brain that I did, it's there to stay. So this was a really fascinating mission, I've got to say. After all those years of being an American fighter pilot, training to shoot down Russian MiG pilots, I got to work with 4 Russian MiG pilots in the course of this who had been training to shoot me down at the same time. So this was pretty fascinating, getting to go to the Mir. In the American space program, rendezvous and docking is all flown manually by the commander. So I got to do this. I got to fly the first docking that a shuttle ever did. And it's flown manually from 2 miles on in, out the window basically, along with a laser rangefinder. And we had a television camera that looked out of our docking port so that I could line up precisely on the docking port on the Mir Space Station. And it went very nicely. We got aboard and we had a big TV moment. It took about an hour and a half after docking before we got the pressure equalized between the 2 vehicles, had live TV down to Moscow, live TV down to Houston. The week before the launch, the NASA administrator had said, Hoot, don't worry about this now, no pressure for the docking, but there will be 5 billion people around the world watching you on TV. So no pressure. But anyway, it went very successfully because in the simulators we had done about 100 dockings, so we were very well prepared for it. This handshake was announced by President Clinton that night on the evening news to mark the end of the Cold War. So it was my model aviation experience that prepared me to go out and end the Cold War. So that's how that all happened. We got to spend 5 days aboard the Mir Space Station. And people ask me all the time, well, what was it like on board Mir? Well, here's a picture of what it was like on board Mir. The place was a mess. And what's really funny is that the cosmonaut in this picture in the blue suit, Vladimir Dezhurov, was the mission commander. He was one of those MiG pilots. The other one in the red suit, by the way, was the other MiG pilot. Vladimir on the right side flew MiG-29s. And Anatoly, on the left side, Anatoly Solovyev was a MiG-25 Foxbat pilot. So those guys were both my targets, is what they were. Vladimir had called his whole crew together the week before we got there, all 3 of them, and said, okay guys, listen up, shuttle's going to be up here next week, so we got to clean this place up. So this is cleaned up. We stayed with them, as I mentioned, for 5 days. We had a lot of work to do. We had more than 400 items to transfer from the shuttle to the Mir, or from the Mir back to the shuttle. We also gave them 1,100 pounds of water. And of course, water, as we know, is critical to us, living things, and they have to carry it up. Well, we make water on board the space shuttle in generating electricity. We have fuel cells, so we take hydrogen and oxygen, combine them together, that generates electricity. The byproduct is water. So we gave them 1,100 pounds of water while we were there, 1 bucket at a time. My flight engineer was Greg Harbaugh, and they have this Russian bucket that's about this big that works in weightlessness, and he would plug it into our water tanks and then just gradually fill 1 bucket, take it over to the Mir, empty it over there, bring back the bucket, refill it again over the space of about 3 days. And his name was Greg Harbaugh, and we called him Gregadin, is what we were calling him. He didn't like it either. He did not enjoy being called Gregadin, but we transferred a lot of stuff over to them. Stayed for 5 days, undocked, and then flew around the Mir Space Station 3 times so that we could get photography of it from all different angles so we could see what kind of condition it was in after having been in space. At this point, it had been up there 9 years. And so we wanted to see how much micrometeorite impact we could see on it, and there was some substantial evidence of that. And also weathering of it. You know, you wouldn't think there's any weather, but there's something up in orbit called atomic oxygen, and it oxidizes the outer surface of a spacecraft over years of time. And so we wanted to characterize all of that. Okay, time to glide back in and land. Now you probably know when we come back into the atmosphere, we don't have any engines left. We are a 200,000-pound glider. And so we get how many tries at a landing? 1.0. We get 1.0 attempts to land it. So we trained very extensively, and this is what you see out the window when you come back in. We hit the air still going 17,500 miles an hour, which equates to 25 times the speed of sound. Mach 25 is what we hit the atmosphere at. We create a shock wave that winds up being 9,000 degrees Kelvin right outside your window. Well, the sun is 6,000 degrees Kelvin. The surface of the sun is 6,000 degrees. So it's as hot as the surface of the sun right out the window. And this is what you see. And it's an exciting ride coming back down, because you fly totally surrounded by fire and flame for 15 minutes. You can't see out your windows at all. All you can see is fire and flame for 15 solid minutes. And I remember thinking on my first mission, as we're gliding back in Challenger, when the fire died out, when we had slowed all the way down to just Mach 10, the fire finally dies out, thinking to myself, I cannot believe anything man-made can fly through an environment like this and survive. Fortunately, it can. And of course, we wind up in gliding flight back in the atmosphere. Our approach to the runway is a 20-degree dive angle at 300 knots indicated airspeed. And we will hold that dive down to 1,700 feet above the ground, and then we go into our flare from 1,700 feet, aiming to touch down at 205 knots, 2,500 feet down the runway. Starting in 1992, we got the drag chute incorporated aboard the shuttle. Prior to that, we had destroyed our brakes on just about every single landing, because all we had was those 4 little tires on the main gear that had brakes on them. And we're talking a 220,000-pound vehicle going 200 knots with nothing but brakes to get you stopped. So we would destroy our brakes. And we had all these arguments with some of our engineers, because they said, well, it's not a safety issue, it's a reuse issue. Well, I agree. When we had pieces laying on the ground when we came to a stop, you're not going to reuse those. So yeah, sort of a reuse issue. But the only thing we had for steering below 140 knots was brakes. The nose wheel steering didn't work in the early days, and all we had was brakes. So we really needed them for control as well. Anyway, we finally went to carbon brakes, got the drag chute, and now it works great. And then you get out and pose for hero pictures like this one. They will let us walk around the vehicle if we do it quickly, i.e. meaning stay in your suits. You don't get to get out of those hot, stuffy, uncomfortable spacesuits in Florida in the afternoon. So you got to walk around kind of quick, because they want to get us to the clinic so they can start testing us to death to see what has happened to us in 10 days, in this case, in orbit. And the body does undergo some pretty significant changes being weightless. So anyway, we finished walking around. We got out in front of the vehicle. NASA photographer says, click, 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 shot a couple pictures. Then he said, okay, guys, give me a big thumbs up. And I'm sitting there going, oh, this is so cheesy. I can't believe we're doing this. But you know what? Made kind of a neat picture after all. So, okay, he was right. Well, gee, I mentioned the Pogo, that model that I had earlier. That last photo was taken in 1983. And here's the Pogo in October of this month. So it hasn't made a whole lot of progress, I have to admit. So it's a work, well, I can't even call it a work in progress, because there hasn't been a whole lot of progress. But now that we've got the electric motor technology that we've got, I think I like that a whole lot better than my contra-rotating props. So I think I'm going to, like I say, convert it over. And I've still got a bunch of RC ducted fan jets. I really enjoy the electric fans. They're so much easier than my big red F-16 in the background. that was gas powered, and I want to convert it over to a ducted fan as well. So as I mentioned, I've been a member of AMA since I was about 15 years old. It's been a great ride. It has taught me so much about flying, so much about aviation, aerodynamics, as I mentioned, stability and control, and all of those things. And I know it has played significantly into my success, whatever success I may have had as an aviator. The AMA and model airplanes have played a big part in that. And so I've had the bug since I was very young. I don't know about 2 like they put on the flyer, but I've had the bug since I was very young, and I'm very grateful and appreciative to the Academy of Model Aeronautics for helping open my eyes to that wonderful world of aviation that's out there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It says it's ready. Now my plan is I'm going to take off and head out that way and then make mostly left turns. Boy, the electrics are sure handy for being able to get out by yourself. Face that when we get to it. Oh yeah. I had it a little too close to me, I'm afraid. I'm astronaut Hoot Gibson. Get the bug, fly a model. It's awesome.